I've haunted in the bush. For a week, I'd had trouble sleeping. I wanted to see Mitch and my parents when I closed my eyes, but not in the way that had been coming to me as of late. Mom showed up in my tent with her mouth sewn shut and her left arm missing. Dad, sitting by the fire, drinking out of a mason jar, then jumping into the flames when I got close enough to smell the moose hide of his mitts. I spent a lot of time with Riri, and she took full advantage of my resistance to sleep. Where did you walk from? The outer city. Did the recruiters chase you? They would have. My brother stopped them. Did your brother get taken? Yeah, Ree, he got taken. What did he look like? He seemed really big, but I don't think he was. I think maybe he was just always bigger than me. He had eyes that were blue sometimes but looked gray, and his hair was almost black. His teeth were crooked, so that the front ones looked like they were holding hands. It was painful, but I didn't really mind. The more I described my brother, my parents, our makeshift community before Dad left with the council, the more I remembered, like the way my uncle jigged to heavy metal. Instead of dreaming of their tragic forms, I recreated them as living, laughing people in the cool red confines of Riri's tent as she drifted off. I woke up with stiff muscles and frozen toes on her tarp one morning, her small form huddled under layers, cheeks pink with warmth and rest. I must have fallen asleep in the middle of talking the night before. I could see my breath and hear the near constant rain pattering on the vinyl walls. A slow, steady drizzle. That's the best we could hope for these days. Meg couldn't explain the science of it, but ever since the north had started melting, there were more rains. I shook the damp out of my legs and laced my boots back on, wrapping the tops in strips of fabric that tore as I knotted them. Almost time to replace them. Thank God I was done with the last growth spurt. I'd end up having to wear flip-flops for weeks. They were the only things that fit until we scavenged a forgotten fishing lounge and found the boots I wore now. Outside, Wab and She-Boy were already packing up her tent. She moved away from him when I came out, and he shuffled off to fold up his own tent, leaving her to wind the rope and store her pegs. Something about their movements, choppy and stilted, made me feel awkward. I tried to fill the space with words. Good morning. Hey, Wab, started breakfast yet? Twins are on meal duty. They're homesteaders. Oh, right. I forgot it was hunting day. Yippee, more squirrel and mushroom stew. She didn't answer. Instead, she gave me a wry look, then started braiding her hair as she watched Cheeboy work. Not that I don't like your stew, it's just... Thankfully, I was interrupted when Slopper farted loud and long from his tent. We couldn't help but laugh. Christ, sounds like that one ripped a hole in the ground, one of the twins shouted from the main latrine behind a dense thicket. Chuckles could be heard from Mig and Minerva's tents. Gross! Ree was up. With that introduction to the new day and the camp to life, one by one, brushing their teeth with brushes worn to stiff nubs, beating the wet out of clothes by slapping them against trunks, and running tight circles around the perimeter to warm up. We sat in a quiet circle, packing our gear and waiting for food. The hunters strapped on the wristwatches we shared. Mig didn't need one. He kept a pocket watch in his jeans. It was important for hunters to keep time, so we could keep track of each other and the day. We never used to need these things, Meg commented as we wound the mechanisms and checked that they were synchronized. But no one has the skill of telling time by the sky here. Maybe one day we'll run into someone who does. Then we won't have to rely on these things no more. The twins opened a few tins of condensed milk, handing the empty cans to Minerva, who rinsed them out in a puddle. She smiled when she cleaned the lids and pulled them off, stashing them in the leather crossbody bag she wore every day. Who knew what she was up to? Minerva connected odd things. We didn't even question it anymore. Meg crushed the tins as small as they could go, so we could bury them along with our other minimal garbage by the latrine. After a hasty breakfast of mush, the hunters were off, eager to take advantage of the halt in the rain and the appearance of sliced sunlight through the spirited crowds. It's often necessary to break up a larger group to achieve our goal, especially since a lone shadow can get into more spots without notice than a larger group. We were a 50-minute hike from the camp. I want you all to get used to the idea of operating alone. Meg was crouched down in the middle of a huddle, checking the ground for fresh prints. There's signs of deer in this area, maybe something bigger. If we work separately but together, we should bring back a nice buck. Woohoo! Slopper pumped his fist into the air, being a huge fan of fresh deer meat. But only, continued Meg, looking at the excited boy, if we can stay quiet and focused. Slopper lowered his fist and shuffled his feet. Meg stood, put his hands on his lower back, and stretched. We're going to each go our separate ways, so make sure that you keep track of which direction you walk. Cross twigs on the path when you change directions to find your way back without tipping off potential predators. Have your weapons ready. Chiboy and Wob were carrying bows. Slopper, not having graduated to full hunter status, carried a sharpened stick. Meg had his 45, and I had the rifle slung over my shoulder. Chiboy used to carry the rifle, but he and Wob have been spending time relearning bow hunting, so it fell to me now. Bows are sustainable. Eventually, we won't be able to get more bullets, and I can at least make arrows, he'd explained. I think they just liked having this thing they shared in common, never mind all the hours it provided them alone to practice. Everyone goes a different way. Keep a steady but mindful pace, the same speed we keep on the trail when we move camp. An hour's walk, no more. Then you find a lookout and wait. Meg reloaded his handgun and tucked it back into his waistband. With his long raincoat, with the popped-up collar and the 45 in his wide leather belt, he looked like an old-timey gunslinger. We wait for 2 hours, then make your way back. If there's a problem, you all know the alarm. Chiboy? Chiboy threw his head back and let out a screech that curved up into a tail before fading. An eagle. Okay? We all nodded, then turned and pushed off into the bush like swimmers from the block. I walked southeast, careful to pace my steps so that I was moving neither too fast nor too slow to keep the ground synchronicity that would make it easier to track anyone who didn't return on time. Just in case, our lives were a series of actions twinned with just-in-case reactions. The ground was cold and soggy. I could feel it through my boots. The earth barely had a chance to absorb the rainwater before the next deluge. It hadn't been this bad even when I was on the move with my parents and brother. Every year, the world was making us more aware of change. After the cities crumbled off the coastlines and the hurricanes and earthquakes made us fear for solid ground to stand on, even now we were waiting for the planet to settle so we could figure out ways which would be safe. But for now, there was just movement, especially for us, the hunted trying to hunt. I concentrated on my gait, marking the changes in direction, following nothing but the way my feet seemed to divine. I made up goals as I walked to pass the time. If I avoided snapping even one twig in the next 5 minutes, it meant I would stop 10 minutes early. If I could remember the names of Mom's 3 favorite books, I would rest for 3 minutes. Even if I did manage to stay quiet, even if I did remember the books, I still walked on. At 59 minutes, 32 seconds, I stopped, pulled my lighter hunting bag and the rifle off my back, and settled into the nook made by a felled tree. I pushed up the guts of its roots where they had been yanked out of the ground. The hole it left had filled with filthy water, but the roots were dry and tangled enough to make a comfortable seat. I climbed into the roots and leaned back. It was kind of soothing like that, with a dozen wooden knuckles massaging my back. I leaned my head into the mess, limbs dangling with no effort, just another set of roots protruding out of the fallen tree. I exhaled and paid attention to the way my lungs sank in, with just a little bit of rattle left over at the end from my annual bronchitis. My mind wandered. I tried to keep it focused on my surroundings, but I was tired, so I let it run a bit off leash for a lack of energy to remain disciplined. From where we were now, running, looking at reality from this point in time, it seemed as though the world had suddenly gone mad. Poisoning your own drinking water? Changing the air so much the earth shook and melted and crumbled? Harvesting a race for medicine? How? How could this happen? Were they that much different from us? Would we be like them if we had a choice? Would they like us enough to let us live? Would they like us enough to let us live? I thought about the sickness and the insanity that crept like bedbugs through families while they slept. What would I have done to save my parents or Mitch, given the chance? Would I have been able to trap a child? To do what? Cut them into pieces? To boil them alive? I shuddered. I didn't want to know what they did, and I really didn't want to know what if I'd be capable of doing it. Time passed. I may have fallen asleep once or twice. The world out here was quiet, like the land was holding its breath. But if you listened, really put conscious action into listening, things began to sing. Insects with wings pirouetted somewhere above my prone head. From the hole where the tree had once held onto the earth came the sound of deep movement. Maybe just the mud shifting. A small group of birds chatted with some clipped formality in the pines on the other side of the clearing, and then there were footsteps. I lifted my head, flexing my arm to raise the rifle into position. Solid shuffling over by the pines. I aimed the gun, watching the trees, praying for nothing more than a deer, nothing human, really. It was huge, like a tree had yanked itself up and was slowly moving into the clearing, a tree with bone-white branches. It walked further into the grass. A moose. I'd never seen one this close before. Adrenaline made my teeth chatter. Time is slow in that vacuum of space. In this new space, I had time to aim squarely between the moose's eyes, watching his muscles contort and his skin wrinkle as he bent to take another mouthful of grass. Then I decided against it, lowering the barrel to his chest. Always go for the sure target. Meg had taught us that in one of my first hunts, and I listened to my elders. Just then he raised his head, so massive I wondered at the blood it must take to animate, and he saw me. He blinked a long, slow blink, and faltered for only a second or two before he began chewing again. He turned a bit so that I knew he knew I was there. I swallowed hard, aiming, fingers exact and stiff. He was so friggin' big. It was like he was 100 years old, like he had watched all of this happen. Imagine being here through it all, the wars, the sickness, the earthquakes, the schools, only to come to this. He exhaled, long and loud into the wind. This was food for a week. Hide and snoot to stitch together for tarps, blankets, ponchos. There was bones for pegs and chisels. This was me, the conquering hero, marching into the camp with more meat than all of us could carry, taking the others back to the field to dress this gift. This was Rose looking at me with those big dark eyes, so dark they shone burgundy in the firelight. This was my chance. But could we travel with this meat before it rotted? No. And could we smoke it and dry it? No, Meg wouldn't set up camp for that long, especially not with a steady thread of smoke reaching above the trees, blasting a signal to anyone who might be out there. So we'd be leaving half, at least half, behind to rot. The moose watched all this play out on my face, a dirty boy, tangled in the roots of an upended tree, hiding from the world, hiding from memories of family and days without pursuit. And he stayed perfectly still. His eyes were huge, dark globes that reflected back in their surroundings. I was sure I could see myself in there, in the trees, a long-haired warrior taking aim. I lowered the rifle. He blinked once more, then crossed his legs, one over the other, as if the start of a curtsy, then turned back into the trees. I couldn't do it. I couldn't let it come to this, not for him and not for me. Walking back to the meeting point, I swung between peace with my decision and retching regret. I was empty-handed, but something in my chest was burning a little brighter. I was okay with my decision, but not okay with the consequences. I secretly hoped no one else had gotten anything, so I wouldn't be the only loser, even if it meant we went hungry for a day. I pictured Riri's face, sad because of an empty belly. That made me ashamed. As it turned out, I didn't have to worry about Riri. When I made it to the meeting spot, Chiboy and Midge were already there, each with a wild turkey strung in the lower branches of a maple. Grabbed mine in the first 20 minutes. The rest must have been scared off by the shot and headed towards Chiboy there. He grabbed one too. Meg was laughing, enjoying a hand-rolled smoke. Slopper was napping, leaning against a log. No luck, French? Watching them pat each other on the back and proudly spin their turkeys, examining their carcasses for size and weight, I was back to wrenching regret. Nope, nothing. Chiboy glanced at his watch. 10 past. She'll be here, Meg scanned the area. She's good. Meg told the story of his turkey and rolled a new smoke to replace the old one he'd finished. Slopper was awake now, yanking out a few of the nicer feathers from Chiboy's bird. Chiboy didn't protest. He was pacing the perimeter, looking at his watch. 25 after. Boy, give her another 10 and then we'll start off in her direction. Meg was sympathetic but short. She's fine. Better out here than most of us. We'd almost hit the 10-minute deadline when Wob silently slipped in beside us. Chiboy sighed and even smiled, but he made no movement towards her. She was empty-handed, which was weird for her, not that it bothered me. Misery loves company, I suppose. Everything's okay? Meg's forehead wrinkled at her expression. She nodded. Let's head back. Without another word, she led the way back to camp. She didn't tell us what she'd seen out there until it slipped out a week later.